What time is it now? Perhaps the house is quiet, and the only light comes from the screen in front of you. It is in these hours of silence that the mind often drifts to the past, to the stories we have been told are true. They say history is written by the victors. It is a phrase we accept without question, a comfort that suggests order and finality. But if history is written by the winners, what happens to the accounts written by the survivors? Consider for a moment a different possibility. What if the most important record of human history was not a religious text, but a warning? A warning not about sin, but about genetics, about biology, and about a specific group of entities that descended from the stars. For nearly 2,000 years, this warning remained silent, buried in the driest place on Earth, waiting for a specific moment to return. That moment was 1947. The setting is the desolate, sun-baked cliffs of Qumran, overlooking the Dead Sea. It is a landscape that looks more like the surface of Mars than a home for men. Here, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was searching for a lost animal. It was a mundane task, a small event in a vast desert. To frighten the animal out of a cave, he threw a stone into the darkness. He did not hear the bleating of a goat. He heard the sharp, crisp sound of shattering pottery. That sound was the breaking of a seal that had held for 20 centuries. Inside the cave, hidden within tall, cylindrical clay jars, were scrolls wrapped in linen that had turned to dust. The world would come to know them as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest archaeological discovery of the modern age.
Book of Isaiah.
Scholars and theologians rejoiced, claiming these texts validated the Bible, confirming the history of Isaiah and the Psalms. But in their celebration, they whispered about something else. They found something that did not fit the narrative of a standard religious library. Among the scrolls, preserved with an obsession that bordered on fear, were multiple copies of a text that had been banned, burned, and erased from the Western canon. The Book of Enoch. The Essenes, the mysterious sect that hid these scrolls, did not treat Enoch as a fable. They treated it as the cornerstone of their reality. In the face of the encroaching Roman Empire, when they had to choose what to save from the coming fire, they chose this book. Why? Because the Book of Enoch was not merely scripture. It was a criminal dossier. It did not speak of angels as creatures of light and wings, singing in a spiritual heaven. It spoke of them as physical beings, the Watchers, who made a conscious decision to defect. It detailed their names, their ranks, and their specific crimes. It described a biological intervention that changed the course of human evolution. The discovery of these scrolls in 1947 is where the timeline becomes suspicious. Coincidence is a comfort for those who do not wish to see the patterns. 1947 was not just the year of the scrolls. It was the year the CIA was founded. It was the year the United Nations voted to re-establish Israel, returning the people of the book to the land of the book. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it was the year of Roswell. At the precise moment humanity began looking to the skies, questioning if we were alone in the universe, the earth opened up to reveal a text that said we have never been alone. It suggests that the visitors we fear in the future are actually the architects of our past. Yet, despite this discovery, you will not find the Book of Enoch in the pew of your local church. You will not hear it read during Sunday service. It remains on the fringe, labeled as Apocrypha, dismissed as legend. This exclusion is not an accident. It is the result of a very old, very deliberate decision.
This one is
Centuries
tainted.
ago,
Send it
the
to
most
flames.
powerful men in
this one
the
is
newly
sound
formed
doctrine.
church
Place it here.
gathered to curate the Bible. They looked at the Book of Enoch, and they did not see a lie. they saw a truth that was too dangerous to be allowed. They realized that if the common man read this book, the entire structure of their authority would collapse. So they decided to erase it. But to understand why they feared it, we must look at what they tried to destroy. The story does not begin in a cave in 1947. It begins much earlier, with a meeting of specific individuals who decided that some history was meant to sleep forever. But shadows were lengthening, and the real story of the erasure had yet to begin. The shadow of erasure is often cast long before the light is fully extinguished. For the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, the Book of Enoch was not a forbidden text. It was a cornerstone. It was quoted by the apostles, referenced in the Epistle of Jude, and studied by the early church fathers with the same reverence given to the prophets Isaiah or Daniel. Tertullian, one of the fiercest defenders of the early faith, famously called it Scripture, explicitly stating it was preserved by Noah during the flood. So how does a text go from being Scripture to being a heresy punishable by death? It does not happen by accident. It happens by design. The turning point came in the 4th century, a time when the church was transitioning from a persecuted cult into the official power structure of the Roman Empire. With power came the need for order, and with the need for order came the intolerance for anything that suggested the universe was messy, biological, or uncontrollable. The narrative of the Book of Enoch was simply too dangerous for a new empire trying to consolidate control. Consider the implications. If the sons of God mentioned in Genesis were indeed physical beings who descended, mated with women, and taught humanity forbidden sciences, then the authority of the church and the emperor was secondary to a much older, more terrifying hierarchy. It meant that humanity's struggles were not just moral failings, but the result of a genetic contamination initiated by a superior intelligence. That was a story they could not allow. And so, the sons of God had to be redefined. Julius Africanus and later St. Augustine, the architect of Western theology, began the systematic campaign to rewrite history. They proposed a new theory, one that stripped the supernatural from the text entirely. They claimed that the sons of God were merely the sons of Seth, normal human men from a righteous lineage, and the daughters of men were simply women from the wicked lineage of Cain. It was a semantic pivot of genius proportions. In one stroke, they turned an interspecies cosmic invasion into a simple story about bad marriage choices. They turned the Watchers into men and the Nephilim into mere tyrants. They took the physical, terrifying reality of the ancient world and turned it into a harmless allegory. Once the meaning was changed, the book itself became a liability. The Council of Laodicea, meeting in the mid-4th century, issued Canon 60, which listed the canonical books. Enoch was quietly left off the list. Philastrius condemned it as heresy. The message was clear. Stop reading this. Copies were burned. Scribes were ordered to stop reproducing it. For over 1,000 years, the Book of Enoch effectively vanished from the Western world. It was assumed lost, a myth mentioned only in footnotes by men who mocked it. But truth is a stubborn thing. While Europe slept in the curated silence of the Dark Ages, the book survived. It did not survive in the marble halls of Rome or the libraries of Constantinople. It survived in the remote highlands of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, isolated by geography and unconcerned with Roman politics, kept the book in their Bible. They protected it not as a curiosity, but as the literal word of God. They knew what the West had chosen to forget. The silence was total until the late 18th century, when the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia with 3 copies of the text. But even then, it was treated as a novelty, a confused jumble of hallucinations. It wasn't until the discovery at Qumran in 1947 that the world was forced to admit the uncomfortable truth. The Ethiopians were right. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved that the text Bruce found was identical to the ancient Aramaic writings of the Essenes. The text hadn't changed. We had. So we must ask the question that Augustine tried to bury. If we strip away the Sethite interpretation, if we ignore the centuries of theological cover-ups and read the text exactly as it was written, what does it say? It begins with a warning. It does not start with creation. It starts with a specific location, a specific number of entities, and a decision that would permanently scar the genetic code of this planet. The erasure failed. The file is open. And the first entry takes us to the summit of a mountain that still sits on our maps today. Watching over the Middle East like a silent sentinel, mythology usually takes place in the clouds, or in realms that cannot be mapped. It is vague, dreamlike, and unreachable. But the Book of Enoch is different. It does not ask you to imagine a spiritual heaven. It gives you a grid reference. It states with clinical precision that the descent of the Watchers happened at a specific location. And they descended on Ardis, which is the summit of Mount Hermon. This is not a metaphor. Mount Hermon is a very real, very imposing limestone mountain cluster on the border between Syria and Lebanon. It dominates the landscape, its snow-capped peaks visible from miles away. If you were to open a map today, or look at satellite imagery, you would see something strange about this mountain. It is not a tourist destination. It is not a place of pilgrimage for the faithful. It is one of the most heavily militarized zones on the face of the planet. Today, the summit of Mount Hermon is home to the highest permanent United Nations base in the world. It is bristling with radar arrays, listening posts, and electronic warfare technology operated by the Israeli Defense Forces and international observers. They tell us this is because of its strategic height, the eyes and ears of the state. But is it just a coincidence that the modern world's most advanced surveillance technology sits on the exact same rock where the ancient world's Watchers first touched down? The very name of the mountain holds a secret. In Hebrew, Hermon is derived from the root word herem. Herem does not mean holy, it means banned, it means forbidden. It refers to something that is consecrated for destruction, something that must not be touched. For thousands of years, local traditions have regarded the mountain with a mixture of awe and terror. It was known as the Mountain of the Oath. It was a place where the barrier between this world and the next was dangerously thin. The Book of Enoch suggests that this mountain was ground zero. It was the landing site of an expeditionary force. When we strip away the religious language, the text describes a physical arrival. These entities did not manifest in a vision. They came down. They occupied high ground. From this vantage point, they could look down upon the plains below, where the daughters of men were living their simple agrarian lives. They were not there to protect. They were there to covet. The mountain stands today as a geological witness, a massive stone monument to a breach in planetary security. And the beings who landed there, they were not what Sunday school has led you to believe. Who were they? Ask a priest, and he will tell you they were fallen angels, spiritual beings made of light and ether who succumbed to pride. But the text of Enoch, and the older Sumerian records that parallel it, paints a disturbingly biological picture. The text refers to them as the Iron in Aramaic, translated as the Watchers, or in Greek, egregoroi. meaning the wakeful ones. These were not ephemeral spirits. They were tangible. They required resources. They had a hierarchy. They had names. The text lists their commanders with the precision of a military roster. Semjaza, the leader. Arakiel, Ramil, Tamiel, Azazel. These are not poetic titles. They are ranks. The Book of Enoch tells us there were exactly 200 of these officers who descended in the days of Jared. If we perform a semantic pivot here, replacing the theological term angel with the modern concept advanced biological entity, the story suddenly makes terrifying sense. They are described as being physically imposing, white as snow, with eyes that burned like lamps. In every ancient encounter, the human reaction to them is not spiritual ecstasy, it is visceral terror. It is the reaction of a primitive species encountering a superior predator, and they were compatible. This is the key that unlocks the horror. Spirits do not have DNA. Spirits do not reproduce, but the Watchers did. They looked at human women not with the detached love of a guardian, but with the biological urge of a colonizer. They recognized genetic compatibility. This suggests that the gap between human and Watcher was not as wide as we think. Perhaps we were made in their image, or perhaps they had tweaked us long before this descent. But this specific descent was different. This wasn't authorized. This wasn't a mission of guidance. The text makes it clear that Semjaza, their commander, was terrified. He knew that what they were about to do, mixing their seed with the local population, was a violation of the highest cosmic law. On the frozen, wind-swept summit of Mount Hermon, Semjaza turned to his 199 subordinates. He didn't speak of love or enlightenment. He spoke of guilt. He said to them, "I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." He was afraid of being the fall guy. He needed accomplices. What happened next was not a religious ritual. It was a conspiracy. It was a blood pact signed in the shadow of a crime that would eventually require the oceans to wash it away. Why does a superior being need to take an oath? If these were divine messengers acting on orders, there would be no need for a pact. Soldiers following a command do not huddle in the dark and swear secrecy. They simply obey. The very existence of this oath is the smoking gun. It proves premeditation. It proves that what was about to happen was not a mistake, nor an accident, but a calculated crime against the cosmic order. On the windswept peak of Hermon Semjaza, the commander of the Watchers, stood before his troops. He was intelligent. He understood the mechanics of universal law better than any human ever could. He knew that crossing the species barrier, mixing the celestial with the terrestrial, would trigger a catastrophic reaction from the universe itself. He knew that once the genetic line was crossed, there was no going back, and he was afraid. The Book of Enoch records his hesitation with chilling clarity. He feared that once the heat of the moment passed, his subordinates would back down, leaving him to face the judgment of the Most High alone. So the 200 Watchers did something that sounds less like a choir of angels and more like a criminal syndicate. They engaged in a ritual of mutual imprecation. The text says, "Then swear they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it." A mutual imprecation is not a simple promise. It is a curse. It is a binding contract sealed with a terrifying condition. If we fail to do this, or if any of us turns back, may the destruction fall upon us all. They locked their fates together. They created a collective consciousness of guilt. By sharing the blame, they hoped to dilute the punishment. It was this act, this specific moment of rebellion, that gave the mountain its name. Hermon, the forbidden place, the place of the curse. For centuries, people living in the shadow of that mountain have felt an unease they cannot explain. Now we know why. The rocks up there didn't just witness a landing. They witnessed the signing of a declaration of war against nature. Once the oath was sworn, the hesitation vanished. The 200 entities, now bound by blood and fear, turned their gaze away from the stars they had abandoned and looked down toward the valleys. Below them, the settlements of early humanity were waking up, completely unaware that the gods were not watching over them from the heavens, but were descending the slopes with a specific, predatory hunger. The planning was over. The great incursion was about to begin. And the first target was not the kings or the armies of men. The target was the human genome itself. We often think of sin in moral terms: stealing, lying, murder. These are crimes of behavior. But the event that triggered the collapse of the ancient world was not a crime of behavior. It was a crime of biology. The Book of Genesis, in a passage so brief that most people skim over it, drops a statement that defies all theological logic. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Stop and consider the physics of that sentence. If the sons of God were truly non-corporeal spirits, beings of light and frequency, how could they feel physical desire for human women? A beam of light does not lust after a flower. A ghost does not hunger for flesh. The very fact that they saw and desired proves a terrifying truth. The Watchers were biological entities. They had bodies. They had hormones. And most dangerously of all, they had compatible DNA. This brings us to the compatibility paradox. In nature, species barriers are absolute. A lion cannot mate with an eagle. A man cannot produce offspring with a chimpanzee, despite our genetic similarities. The codes do not match. The lock rejects the key. So how is it possible that beings from the stars, entities that allegedly evolved in a completely different environment, could successfully breed with human women? There are only two possibilities, and both are unsettling. The first is that they used advanced genetic engineering to bridge the gap, forcing a compatibility where none existed. The second possibility is even more profound, that they didn't need to force it, that we are so similar to them, perhaps because they had a hand in our creation long before this event, that the biological lock opened effortlessly. The text of Enoch suggests that the beauty of the daughters of men was the catalyst. But was it just aesthetic beauty? Or was it a genetic signal? In the animal kingdom, physical traits often signal genetic health and reproductive viability. When the Watchers looked down from Mount Hermon, they didn't just see pretty faces. They saw a harvest. They saw a fresh, uncorrupted gene pool that they could exploit. The phrase, "they took them wives of all which they chose," is not a description of marriage. It is a description of acquisition. It implies a lack of consent. It implies a selection process. They didn't come to love us. They came to use us as incubators. They broke the prime directive of the cosmos. You do not mix the upper with the lower. You do not mix the immortal with the mortal. By crossing this line, they weren't just breaking a rule. They were initiating a biological experiment that would produce a reaction the Earth had never seen before. The women who were taken didn't know it yet, but they were not carrying children. They were carrying the end of the world. Biology is a cruel architect. It designs every organism with specific limits, specific tolerances. When a human mother carries a human child, the process is already a precarious balance. The mother's immune system must be suppressed just enough so it doesn't attack the fetus as a foreign invader, yet stays strong enough to keep her alive. It is a 9-month negotiation between two bodies. But what happens when the fetus is not human? The Book of Enoch does not dwell on the 9 months of gestation. It skips straight to the birth. But other ancient fragments and the Book of Giants found at Qumran hint at a much darker reality. The union between the Watchers and the daughters of men was not a romance. It was a hostile takeover of the womb. Imagine the biological reality. These women were carrying genetic material that was, by definition, supernatural. The energy required to knit together the bones and sinew of a hybrid entity would have been immense. The fetuses didn't just grow, they consumed. It is likely that these pregnancies were accelerated. The human body was never designed to host the DNA of the iron. The result would have been a metabolic nightmare. The mothers would have wasted away, their vitality drained to fuel the rapid development of the monsters inside them. And then came the delivery. In ancient medical texts, a breech birth or a child slightly too large was a death sentence. Now imagine a child that is genetically programmed to be a giant. The birth of the Nephilim was likely the first casualty event of this war. The text coldly states, "And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants." It hides the scream behind the sentence. Countless women likely died bringing these things into the world. Their bodies were torn apart by offspring that were simply too powerful, too large, and too foreign for the human anatomy to contain. These women were the first victims of the Watchers' experiment. They were discarded vessels, used to bridge the gap between the spiritual and the material, and then left broken. And what emerged from this trauma was not a human infant crying for milk. It was something else entirely. It was a being that looked human, but possessed a strength and a hunger that was terrifyingly immediate. As the mothers lay dying, the children stood up. They didn't look at the world with wonder. They looked at it with appetite. The barrier had been breached. The Watchers had successfully planted their flag in the soil of earth, not with a standard, but with a living, breathing abomination. The Nephilim had arrived, and they were hungry. Biology is a cruel architect. It designs every organism with specific limits, specific tolerances. When a human mother carries a human child, the process is already a precarious balance. The mother's immune system must be suppressed just enough so it doesn't attack the fetus as a foreign invader, yet stays strong enough to keep her alive. It is a 9-month negotiation between two bodies, but what happens when the fetus is not human? The Book of Enoch does not dwell on the 9 months of gestation. It skips straight to the birth. But other ancient fragments and the Book of Giants found at Qumran hint at a much darker reality. The union between the Watchers and the daughters of men was not a romance. It was a hostile takeover of the womb. Imagine the biological reality. These women were carrying genetic material that was, by definition, supernatural. The energy required to knit together the bones and sinew of a hybrid entity would have been immense. The fetuses didn't just grow, they consumed. It is likely that these pregnancies were accelerated. The human body was never designed to host the DNA of the iron. The result would have been a metabolic nightmare. The mothers would have wasted away, their vitality drained to fuel the rapid development of the monsters inside them. And then came the delivery. In ancient medical texts, a breech birth or a child slightly too large was a death sentence. Now, imagine a child that is genetically programmed to be a giant. The birth of the Nephilim was likely the first casualty event of this war. The text coldly states, And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants. It hides the scream behind the sentence. Countless women likely died bringing these things into the world. Their bodies were torn apart by offspring that were simply too powerful, too large, and too foreign for the human anatomy to contain. These women were the first victims of the Watcher's experiment. They were discarded vessels, used to bridge the gap between the spiritual and the material, and then left broken. And what emerged from this trauma was not a human infant crying for milk. It was something else entirely. It was a being that looked human, but possessed a strength and a hunger that was terrifyingly immediate. As the mothers lay dying, the children stood up. They didn't look at the world with wonder. They looked at it with appetite. The barrier had been breached. The Watchers had successfully planted their flag in the soil of earth, not with a standard, but with a living, breathing abomination. The Nephilim had arrived, and they were hungry. What did they look like? This is the question that has haunted artists and theologians for centuries. Renaissance painters depicted them as muscular men, perhaps a head taller than average. Hollywood depicts them as rock monsters, but the text of Enoch and the Hebrew etymology itself suggests something far more disturbing. The word used is Nephilim. It comes from the root naphal, which means to fall. They are the fallen ones, or more actively, the ones who cause others to fall. The Book of Enoch describes their size with a number that has baffled scholars: 3,000 ells. If taken literally, this would make them nearly a mile high, a physical impossibility that would crush their own bones under gravity. But this is likely a translation error, a misunderstanding of ancient Sumerian numbering systems. When we correct for the era and look at other texts like the description of Og of Bashan in Deuteronomy, a more realistic yet terrifying picture emerges. We are looking at beings that stood perhaps 9, 12, or 15 feet tall. Imagine a being twice the height of a man, with a bone density 4 times greater, possessing the intellect of a watcher and the aggression of a predator. They were not just big humans. They were a different genus entirely. This explains the universal memory. Why does every single ancient culture on Earth, separated by oceans and thousands of years, have the exact same story? The Greeks had the Titans. The Norse had the Jotun. The Native American tribes speak of the Star People and the red-haired giants of the Lovelock Cave. The Sumerians carved their kings holding lions like house cats. Is it possible that they were all describing the same historical reality? This leads us to the uncomfortable silence in modern archaeology. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hundreds of newspaper reports across America, from the New York Times to local county gazettes, reported the excavation of giant skeletons from the burial mounds of the Midwest. Skeletons 7, 8, 9 feet tall, some with double rows of teeth, some with 6 fingers, and then they vanished. The Smithsonian Institution has been accused by theorists of acting as the vacuum cleaner of history, sweeping these anomalies into the basement, never to be seen again. Why? Because the existence of the Nephilim breaks the narrative. If you admit there was a race of giant, non-human hominids that ruled the Earth 5,000 years ago, you destroy the theory of linear human evolution. You admit that the Bible and the Book of Enoch is not a book of fairy tales, but a history book. The Nephilim were the men of renown, the heroes of old mentioned in Genesis. Think of Hercules, think of Achilles. Were these demigods actually the hybrid offspring of the Watchers? We remember them as heroes because the myths were rewritten. But the people who lived next to them didn't see them as heroes. They saw them as apex predators who had suddenly been introduced into the ecosystem. And like any invasive species, once they established a foothold, they began to consume the resources of their environment at an alarming rate. The world was no longer ours. We were just living in their zoo. Growth requires fuel. This is the first law of thermodynamics applied to biology. To build a bone structure that is 4 times denser than a human's, and to power a muscle mass that can lift boulders, an organism requires a caloric intake that is staggering. The Nephilim were not just large men. They were metabolic engines that could not be turned off. The Book of Enoch describes the escalation of their appetite with a terrifying simplicity. And they consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. Read that again. It is the description of a parasite that outgrows its host. At first, humanity likely worshipped these demigods. We offered them the best of our harvest, the fattest of our livestock. We treated them as kings, hoping for protection. But a field of wheat that feeds a human village for a year might feed a Nephilim for a week. Soon, the granaries were empty. The herds of cattle and sheep were decimated. The ecological balance of the region collapsed under the weight of these invasive apex predators. And when the grain was gone, and the livestock was gone, the Nephilim looked at the only source of protein left. They looked at us. This was the moment the hierarchy of Earth was shattered. For thousands of years, humans had been the masters of the planet. In a single generation, we were demoted. We became livestock. Imagine the psychological trauma of that era. You are no longer the farmer, you are the crop. The text describes a scene of absolute horror. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. This was not just murder, it was a frenzy. They cracked open the marrow of the earth. They drank blood, a taboo in almost every ancient culture, suggesting they needed the vital fluids, the very life force, to sustain their unnatural physiology. It was a bloodbath. The golden age that some myths talk about was actually a red age. And where were the watchers while their children were eating the world? They were watching. Perhaps they were horrified by the monsters they had created, or perhaps this was the plan all along. A chaotic, desperate humanity is easier to manipulate. When people are terrified, when they are starving, when they are being hunted by giants, they will do anything for a weapon. They will trade their souls for a way to fight back. And that is exactly what the Watchers offered next. They saw that humanity was on the brink of extinction, and instead of saving us, they decided to weaponize us. Azazel, one of the highest-ranking commanders, stepped forward. He didn't bring food, he didn't bring medicine. He brought the blueprint for the first sword. The hunger of the giants had broken the world's body. Now, the gifts of the Watchers were about to break the world's spirit. When a civilization is under siege, when giants are eating the livestock and the children, fear becomes the only currency. And fear makes people desperate. The Watchers knew this. They understood that a terrified population is the easiest to manipulate. Enter Azazel. In the hierarchy of the 200 fallen entities, Azazel holds a special dark distinction. While Semjaza was the leader, Azazel was the innovator. He was the technical officer. The Book of Enoch states, "And Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them." To the modern ear, this sounds like a history lesson on the Bronze Age. We think of a blacksmith hammering glowing iron on an anvil. It sounds primitive, but let's apply the semantic pivot. Azazel didn't just teach blacksmithing, he taught materials science. Before this moment, human conflict was limited by biology. You fought with a stone, a stick, or your fists. The damage you could inflict was limited by your muscle power. War was personal, intimate, and small-scale. Azazel changed the physics of killing. He taught them how to extract ore from the rock, a process that requires specific geological knowledge that humans of that era shouldn't have had. He taught them alchemy, how to mix copper and tin to create bronze, or how to temper iron to make it harder than bone. He introduced the concept of the force multiplier. A sword allows a weak man to kill a strong man. A breastplate allows a soldier to survive a fatal blow and keep killing. Why did he do this? If the Watchers were truly benevolent gods, they would have taught agriculture. They would have taught medicine, sanitation, or irrigation. They would have taught us how to build stronger houses to protect ourselves from the giants. But Azazel didn't teach defense. He taught offense. He handed the equivalent of a machine gun to a toddler. This was a deliberate introduction of destabilizing technology. By giving humans the power to kill efficiently, Azazel ensured that we wouldn't just fight the giants, we would fight each other. He turned the human race into a proxy army. The text says he showed them what is behind the earth. This implies mining. It implies digging into the planet to rip out its secrets. This was the moment humanity stopped living on the earth and started exploiting it. We began to tear open the ground to find the materials for our own destruction. The sudden appearance of advanced metallurgy in the archaeological record, appearing almost out of nowhere in ancient Sumer and the Near East, is the fingerprint of this intervention. Historians call it a technological explosion. Enoch calls it a crime. Azazel gave us the ability to industrialize death, and as the first furnaces were lit and the first unnatural smoke rose into the sky, the nature of human society changed forever. The age of innocence ended. The age of empires began, but Azazel wasn't finished. He knew that swords control the men, but he needed something else to control the women. When you hand a weapon to a desperate man, you don't get peace. You get a massacre. The introduction of Azazel's technology, the sword, the shield, the breastplate, did not level the playing field against the giants as humanity might have hoped. Instead, it created a new kind of monster, the warlord. The Book of Enoch describes the immediate aftermath of this technological transfer in one chilling sentence. And there was much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways. History changed gears. Before this moment, archaeological records show that human settlements were largely unfortified. War was rare, ritualistic, and low casualty. But after the gift of Azazel, the strata of the earth suddenly fills with ash layers, evidence of cities burned to the ground. We start finding mass graves. We start finding skulls crushed by metal weapons. This was the birth of total war. Why did the Watchers want this? If we look at this through the lens of the Gnostic mirror, we see a disturbing possibility. War generates energy. It generates fear, pain, and adrenaline. Some esoteric theorists suggest that the Watchers and their hybrid children, the Nephilim, didn't just feed on physical flesh. They fed on the louche, the spiritual energy released during extreme trauma and death. By teaching humans how to kill each other efficiently, Azazel turned the entire planet into a farm of suffering. The blood that soaked into the soil did something to the earth itself. The text says, The earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. This is a profound concept. It suggests that the planet is sentient. It suggests that the physical ground beneath our feet remembers trauma. When enough blood is spilled, the frequency of the planet changes. The voice of the earth began to scream. The violence became self-perpetuating. Men obsessed with the new power of metal began to mimic their oppressors. They wanted to be like the Nephilim, dominant, cruel, and unstoppable. The image of God in man was being overwritten by the image of the beast. But while the men were distracted by the fire of the forge and the glory of the battlefield, the corruption was opening a second front. Azazel had secured the loyalty of the men through power. Now, Semjaza and the other commanders turned their attention to the women. They didn't offer swords. They offered something far more subtle and arguably far more dangerous. They offered the power to alter reality itself. The war for the human soul was being fought on the battlefield, but the war for the human mind was about to be fought in the shadows of the apothecary and the mirror. While Azazel was busy turning the fields of earth into graveyards with the invention of the sword, a quieter, perhaps more insidious revolution was taking place in the shadows. War is loud. You can hear the clash of bronze and the screams of the dying. But the most dangerous weapons are often the ones that make no sound at all. They are the weapons that are ingested, the weapons that enter the bloodstream and rewrite the perception of reality from the inside out. The Book of Enoch tells us that while Azazel taught the men to destroy the body, his commander, Semjaza, along with other high-ranking watchers like Armoros and Barakijal, turned their attention to the women. The text is specific, and if you read it quickly, it sounds like a list of fairy tale tropes. It says they taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. For centuries, theologians dismissed this as folklore. They pictured old crones stirring cauldrons, mumbling nonsense words. They called it witchcraft and left it at that. But let us apply the semantic pivot that is the hallmark of our investigation. Let us strip away the medieval superstition and look at this through the lens of modern science. Charms and enchantments is a primitive way of describing psychological operations, psyops, and hypnosis. And the cutting of roots? That is not gardening. That is organic chemistry. Semjaza was not teaching these women how to grow food. He was teaching them how to identify, extract, and concentrate the alkaloids found in the toxic flora of the earth. He was teaching them how to isolate the active ingredients that can stop a heart, induce a coma, or, most importantly, shatter the mind. Consider the word the New Testament uses for sorcery. The Greek word is pharmakeia. Does that sound familiar? It is the root of our modern word, pharmacy. In the ancient world, the line between a sorcery and medicine was non-existent. Pharmakeia meant the administration of drugs. It referred to potions, spells, and poisoning. The Watchers were the original pharmacists, but they were not dispensing cures. They were dispensing control. Why would they do this? If you want to enslave a species, you have two options. You can put them in chains, which requires constant physical force, the Azazel method. Or you can sever their connection to reality so they don't even realize they are enslaved, the Semjaza method. By teaching humanity the secrets of psychotropic plants, mushrooms, poppies, mandrake, belladonna, the Watchers introduced the first chemical shackles. Imagine the scene. A Watcher, towering and radiant, holding up a simple root. To a human, it looks like a weed. But the Watcher explains that if you dry this root, grind it to dust, and mix it with wine in a precise ratio, it will open a door in the mind that cannot be closed. Getty Images. They taught the women how to brew concoctions that could induce euphoric trances. In these states, humans became pliable. They became suggestible. The barriers of the conscious mind, the safeguards that protect your free will, were dissolved by the chemistry of the plant. This was the birth of the oracle. Historians often wonder why the ancient world was so obsessed with oracles, seers, and shamans who spoke to gods in drug-induced frenzies. We see it at Delphi. We see it in the Amazon. We are told these were spiritual practices. But the Book of Enoch suggests a darker origin. These trances were not a connection to the divine. They were a hacking of the human biological radio. By altering the brain chemistry of the women, the watchers could speak through them, use them as mediums, and influence the tribes of men without ever having to show their faces. They created a layer of priestesses who were actually drug-dependent puppets. But there is an even darker layer to the cutting of roots. We must remember the context. The Nephilim were being born. These giant hybrid pregnancies were tearing women apart. The pain would have been unimaginable. It is highly probable that Semjaza's gift of pharmacology included potent painkillers, early opioids. Think about the leverage this created. If you are a woman in agony, carrying a monster in your womb, and a being offers you a drink that takes the pain away, you will drink it. You will worship the being that gave it to you. You will do anything to keep the supply flowing. This was the first addiction crisis in human history. Furthermore, the cutting of roots likely involved abortifacients and sterilization agents. Why? Because the watchers were conducting a genetic experiment. In any lab experiment, you need to control the variables. You need to decide who breeds and who doesn't. By teaching select women the secrets of which plants prevent pregnancy and which plants terminate it, the watchers effectively seized control of human reproduction. They could ensure that only the women carrying their offspring carried to term, while the pure human lineages could be chemically suppressed. This was a eugenics program disguised as magic. The sorcery of Semjaza was not about waving wands. It was about the systematic chemical alteration of the human species. It was about dulling the pain of our enslavement and severing our natural, sober connection to the Creator. When a mind is clouded by pharmakeia, it cannot pray. It cannot think clearly. It operates in a haze of artificial bliss or terrified hallucination. And isn't it strange? Thousands of years later, look at our world. We are a civilization that runs on the cutting of roots. We harvest the poppy for our pain. We synthesize roots for our depression. We are constantly altering our brain chemistry to cope with reality. The knowledge of Semjaza didn't disappear with the flood. It just moved into a sterile white room, got a patent number, and was put in a plastic bottle. The Watchers taught us that the solution to every problem, spiritual, physical, or emotional, is a substance. And in doing so, they trapped us in a cycle of dependency that has lasted for 5,000 years. But if the drugs were the chains for the mind, the Watchers had one more tool to ensure absolute dominance. They needed to change not just how women felt, but how they looked. They needed to weaponize beauty itself. If Azazel brought the sword to the men, and Semjaza brought the drug to the women, what was left to complete the enslavement? The answer is vanity. But do not mistake this for simple narcissism. In the world of the Watchers, vanity was not a character flaw. It was a military strategy. It was the systematic alteration of the human form to serve a specific, darkened purpose. The Book of Enoch records this crime with a peculiar specificity. It says that Azazel taught the women the art of painting the eyes with antimony, and of beautifying the eyelids, and of using precious stones and all distinct dyes. At first glance, this seems trivial. Why would the holy watchers, the architects of the cosmos, care about eyeliner? Why would a book that deals with the apocalypse stop to mention jewelry? Because it wasn't about looking pretty. It was about sexual signaling and dissociation. Let's look at the painting of the eyes with antimony. In the ancient Middle East, antimony, coal, was a toxic, heavy metal. Applying it to the eyes didn't just darken the lash line, it dilated the pupil. It made the eyes look larger, darker, and more animalistic. Biologically, dilated pupils are a sign of arousal. They are a subconscious trigger. When a predator or a potential mate sees dilated pupils, it triggers an instinctual response in the amygdala. By teaching women to paint their eyes, the watchers were effectively instructing them on how to hack the male libido. They were teaching them how to mimic a state of constant sexual readiness. This transformed the human female from a partner into a lure. In the pre-flood world, where the Nephilim were hungry and the watchers were conducting their genetic harvesting, competition for survival was fierce. The women who could attract the attention of the gods survived. The women who remained plain did not. Thus, beauty became a survival mechanism. And the standard of beauty was not natural, it was artificial. It was dictated by the watchers. This leads us to the concept of the mask. Enoch specifically mentions distinct dyes and the adorning of the face. This was the introduction of the concept that the human face, the way it was created by the original designer, was not good enough. It needed to be covered. It needed to be improved. This is a profound spiritual rebellion. When you paint a mask over your face, you are effectively saying, "I reject the image I was born with. I will create a new image, a better image." Psychologically, a mask allows for dissociation. When a warrior paints his face, he can kill without remorse because he is no longer himself. He is the paint. Similarly, when the women of the pre-flood world donned the mask of Azazel's teachings, they could perform the acts required of them, the mating with monsters, the participation in dark rituals, because they were no longer themselves. They were characters in a play directed by the fallen. And what about the precious stones? The text mentions the use of gems and bracelets. Again, let's pivot. This isn't about decoration. This is about refraction and frequency. Crystals and gemstones vibrate. They manipulate light. In many esoteric traditions, specific stones are used to channel energy. Did the Watchers teach women to wear specific stones, quartz, lapis lazuli, not for fashion, but to act as conductors? Were these women walking antennas, tuning into the frequency of their masters? Imagine a society where the elite women, the wives of the Watchers, glittered with cold, hard light. They painted their eyes black as the void. They dyed their hair with colors not found in nature. They ceased to look human. They looked like the idols that would later be worshipped in Babylon and Egypt. They became the scarlet women of history. And this obsession with the artificial self acted as a mirror maze for the human soul. Instead of looking inward, humanity began to look exclusively outward. How do I look became more important than who am I? The Watchers knew that if they could trap humanity in a cycle of physical perfectionism, we would never have the time or the energy to develop our spirits. A woman obsessed with the mirror does not look at the stars. A man obsessed with the woman in the mirror does not look for God. It was the perfect distraction. And just like the swords of Azazel, and the drugs of Semjaza, this technology never left us. Look at the modern world. We are drowning in antimony and dyes. The cosmetic industry is a multi-billion-dollar empire built on the exact foundation laid down in the Book of Enoch. The insecurity that you are not enough. The belief that to be loved, you must paint the mask. We edit our photos. We inject toxins into our faces to freeze time. We are terrified of our own natural biology. We are still dancing to the tune played by Azazel 5,000 years ago. We are still trying to please the watchers, hoping that if we are beautiful enough, the monsters won't eat us. But the monsters were not satisfied with just the men and the women. The corruption had to be total. The code of life itself had to be rewritten, not just for humans, but for everything that breathed. The next phase of the plan was the most horrific of all. It was the violation of the animal kingdom. The corruption of the human genome was only the beginning. If the Watchers were truly fallen from a higher state of existence, they brought with them an intellect that was not bound by the moral codes of Earth. They viewed our reality not as a garden to be tended, but as a laboratory to be exploited. And like any unethical scientist, once they grew bored with the primary subject, humanity, they turned their scalpels toward the rest of the animal kingdom. The Book of Enoch contains a sentence that is often overlooked because it is so bizarre. The crimes of the giants and their masters, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. For centuries, priests have struggled to interpret this. How do you sin against a fish? The standard religious explanation is bestiality. And while that is a disturbing thought, it is too small. It is too primitive. These were entities capable of space travel or interdimensional travel and advanced metallurgy. They didn't come here just to engage in perversions with livestock. Apply the semantic pivot. Sin, in the original Greek, hamartia, means to miss the mark. It means an error, a deviation from the standard. Sinning against the beasts was not a sexual act. It was a genetic act. It was the systematic violation of the species barrier. We are talking about transgenics. We are talking about the splicing of DNA from one species into another to create something that nature never intended. Look at the Book of Jasher, another ancient text referenced in the Bible. It goes into even more detail, stating that the fallen angels taught men to mix the mixture of one animal with another in order to provoke the Lord. Mixing the mixture. That is the ancient way of describing recombinant DNA technology. This explains one of the greatest mysteries of human mythology. Why does every single ancient culture, from the sands of Egypt to the jungles of South America, from the temples of Greece to the rivers of Babylon, share the exact same bestiary of monsters? We see the centaur, half man, half horse. We see the minotaur, half man, half bull. We see the griffin, half lion, half eagle. We see the mermaid, half human, half fish. We see the sphinx and the lamassu. Historians tell us these are metaphors. They say the ancients had vivid imaginations and simply glued different animals together in their art to symbolize strength or swiftness. But ask yourself, why were they so specific? And why were they so terrified of them? If the age of the Watchers was a real historical epoch, then these creatures were not symbols. They were memories. They were the failed experiments of a biological weapons program. Imagine the scene in the pre-flood world. The forests were no longer safe. The rivers were no longer safe. The Watchers, using their advanced knowledge of the cutting of roots and biological manipulation, were creating chimeras. Why? Perhaps they needed beasts of burden that were stronger than an ox and smarter than a horse. Perhaps they needed biological weapons, creatures designed to hunt, kill, and terrify the rebellious human populations. Or perhaps, most chilling of all, they did it simply because they could. It was the ultimate act of blasphemy. By remixing the code of life, they were mocking the Creator. They were saying, "You made a lion, watch us make it better." But biology fights back. When you mix the DNA of two incompatible species, you don't get a healthy super creature. You get a monster in constant pain. Think of the skeletal structure of a centaur. 2 rib cages, 2 hearts. The circulatory system would be a nightmare. The neural pathways would be mismatched. These creatures would have lived in a state of perpetual agony, their minds torn between the instincts of a predator and the instincts of prey. Their rage would have been uncontrollable. This adds a new layer of horror to the Nephilim narrative. The giants weren't just eating normal cows and sheep. They were hunting and devouring these twisted abominations. The ecosystem of Earth had turned into a carnival of horrors. The sin against the fish, mentioned in Enoch, is particularly interesting. It aligns with the legends of the Oans, fishmen, of Sumer, and the Dagon of the Philistines. Were the oceans also used as a testing ground? Did they try to create an aquatic workforce? This widespread genetic pollution leads us to a terrifying realization about the Great Flood. We are taught that the flood was a judgment on moral wickedness, that God drowned the world because people were bad. But if the genetic code of the entire biosphere had been corrupted, if the birds, the beasts, and the fish were no longer the animals they were created to be, then the flood was not a punishment. It was a quarantine protocol. It was the only way to sterilize the laboratory. To save the planet, the source code had to be reset. The corruption had gone too deep. There was no way to surgically remove the chimeras or the Nephilim. The entire surface had to be scrubbed. But before the water came, the earth itself began to react. We often think of the planet as a rock, a dead thing. But the ancients believed in Gaia, that the earth is a living, breathing entity. And when you torture a living thing, eventually, it screams. If you listen closely to the silence of a deep forest or the stillness of a desert, you can almost feel a hum. It is a vibration, a frequency that exists just below the threshold of human hearing. Scientists call it the Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic heartbeat of the planet. But what happens when that heartbeat begins to race? What happens when the frequency of a planet is disturbed by so much trauma that the signal changes from a hum to a scream? The Book of Enoch provides us with one of the most chilling personifications of nature in all of ancient literature. The verdict on the corruption of the Watchers with a single devastating line. The earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. We often think of the earth as a stage, a passive, inanimate platform where history happens. We fight our wars, build our cities, and bury our dead, assuming the ground beneath us feels nothing. But the ancients knew better. They understood that the planet is a living superorganism. It has a memory. It has a tolerance level. And most importantly, it has a breaking point. By the time the Nephilim had established their dominion, the earth was drowning in blood. The text tells us that the giants were devouring mankind, and when the men were gone, they turned on the animals and finally on each other. Imagine the sheer volume of biological matter soaking into the soil. In forensic science, we know that a crime scene leaves a trace. But this was a planetary crime scene. The blood of millions of humans, the ichor of hybrid monsters, and the chemical runoff from Semjaza's sorcery were saturating the water tables and the crust. This creates a concept known in esoteric circles as geopathic stress. When a specific location witnesses extreme violence, the energy of that place changes. Animals avoid it. Plants grow twisted. Now multiply that by the surface area of the entire globe. The Earth was reacting like a body fighting an infection. The accusation the Earth laid was not a spoken word. It was a vibrational distress signal. The frequency of the planet shifted. The harmony of the natural order was replaced by a dissonance so loud, so jarring, that it began to ripple outwards into the cosmos, and the signal was received. This brings us to a pivotal shift in the narrative. Up until this point, the Watchers, Semjaza, Azazel, and their cohorts, operated with impunity. They acted as if the house was empty, as if the landlord was never coming back. But the scream of Gaia triggered a response from high command. The text describes 4 entities looking down from holy heaven. Their names are familiar, yet their roles here are starkly military. Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. Forget the Renaissance paintings of chubby cherubs playing harps. In the context of the Enochian files, these are the arch-strategists. They are the cosmic surveillance system. They looked down and saw much blood being shed upon the earth, and all lawlessness being wrought upon the earth. They heard the souls of the dead men crying out. Verse 9 says, "The souls of men make their suit to you, saying, 'Bring our cause before the Most High.'" This is a terrifying concept. It suggests that the dead were not resting. The trauma of their deaths, being hunted, eaten, or mutated, was so severe that their consciousness could not move on. They were trapped in the atmosphere of the planet, a swirling cloud of confused, terrified data begging for a system reset. The archangels presented this data to the Creator. Their report is clinical, devoid of emotion, but heavy with implication. They point specifically to Azazel. They don't blame the humans. They don't blame the women. They place the liability solely on the source of the technology. "Thou seest what Azazel hath done, who hath taught all unrighteousness on earth, and revealed the eternal secrets which were preserved in heaven." This is the indictment. The crime wasn't just the violence. It was the leak of classified information. Azazel had given nuclear codes to cavemen. The response from the throne was immediate. There was no trial. There was no negotiation. The experiment had run its course, and the data was corrupted beyond repair. The decision was made to initiate a total sterilization protocol. But there was a problem. The Watchers were not mortal. You cannot kill an entity that exists outside of standard biology with a sword or a flood. They had to be removed, detained, and neutralized before the cleaning could begin. And amidst this cosmic mobilization, there was one man standing in the middle. Enoch. He was not a warrior. He was a scribe, a recorder of facts. And in a twist of irony that only history could write, the very monsters who had corrupted the world turned to him for help. The Watchers, the gods who had descended with such arrogance, suddenly realized that the sky was darkening above them. The distress signal had been heard. The doors of heaven were closing. And for the first time since they landed on Mount Hermon, the Watchers knew fear. They needed a lawyer. They needed someone to carry a message across the developing blockade. They chose Enoch. Why him? Because he was the only human left whose DNA was still pure, whose mind was still sober, and whose frequency could still tune into the broadcast of the Most High. The stage is set for the most impossible meeting in history. The predators are begging the prey for salvation. The hierarchy had flipped. The predators were now the beggars. The Watchers, those terrifying beings of light and power who had treated humanity like lab rats for centuries, were suddenly trembling. Azazel and Semjaza gathered at the foot of Mount Hermon, at a place called Ubal Seyael. They could feel the change in the atmospheric pressure. They knew the blockade was up. Their direct line to the source had been cut. They needed a messenger. They needed someone who still had clearance. And so they turned to Enoch. We often visualize prophets as wild-eyed men screaming in the desert. But Enoch was different. He was a scribe of righteousness. In modern terms, he was an archivist, a recorder of data. He was the only human whose genetic frequency hadn't been scrambled by the corruption of the age. The Watchers asked him to write a petition, a legal writ, begging for forgiveness for what they had done. They couldn't even lift their eyes to heaven anymore. The shame and the radiation of the judgment was too intense. So Enoch took their petition and walked away. He sat by the waters of Dan in the land of Hermon and read the plea until he fell asleep. But what happened next was not a dream. It was an abduction. The Book of Enoch contains one of the most detailed descriptions of alien architecture in all of ancient literature. If we apply the cosmic zoom out, we realize Enoch isn't describing a spiritual cloud. He is describing a technological ascent into a massive craft or a pocket dimension. He describes being lifted by winds, propulsion, and clouds, exhaust. He is propelled upward into the sky until he reaches a structure. Listen to his description of the house of God. It is terrifyingly futuristic. He says, "And I went in till I drew nigh to a wall which is built of crystals and surrounded by tongues of fire, and I began to fear." A wall of crystals, surrounded by fire. Is this a description of advanced thermal shielding? Is he seeing a hull made of materials that his Bronze Age mind can only describe as crystal or ice? He continues, "And I went into the tongues of fire, and drew nigh to a large house which was built of crystals. And the walls of the house were like a tessellated floor, made of crystals, and its groundwork was of crystal. Its ceiling was like the path of the stars and the lightnings." This is not a stone temple. This is a structure composed of transparent, luminescent materials. He describes the ceiling as showing the path of stars. Is he looking through a viewport into deep space? Or is he seeing a holographic projection of the galaxy? The temperature inside this structure defies logic. He says it was hot as fire and cold as ice. This is a paradox. Unless he is describing the vacuum of space or a controlled environment where extreme energy is being contained within a frozen shell. Enoch is overwhelmed. He is shaking. He falls on his face. This is the reaction of a primitive human mind trying to process level 1 civilization technology. Then he sees the throne. And the great glory sat thereon, and his raiment shone more brightly than the sun, and was whiter than any snow. None of the angels could enter and could behold his face, by reason of the magnificence and glory, and no flesh could behold him. The radiation levels are lethal. No flesh could behold him. This isn't just about holiness. It's about physics. The energy output of the entity on the throne is so high that it would vaporize unprotected biological matter. Enoch is witnessing the control room of the local universe. This is the moment of the semantic pivot. We are not looking at a grandfather figure on a cloud. We are looking at the prime administrator, the architect who designed the DNA that the Watchers had so carelessly vandalized. Enoch, the mortal man, is lying on the floor of this crystal ship, clutching a piece of paper, the petition of the fallen angels. He is the lawyer for the defense, standing before a judge who has already signed the execution order. The silence in that room must have been deafening. The hum of the tongues of fire surrounding them, the view of the stars wheeling overhead. And then the voice spoke. It did not speak with anger. It spoke with a devastating, cold logic. It addressed the reversal of roles that defined this entire tragedy. The message Enoch was given to take back to the Watchers was not one of mercy. It was the final nail in the coffin of the pre-flood world. The message was simple. You should intercede for men, and not men for you. It was the ultimate dismissal. The Watchers had failed their job description so completely that they had to ask the lab rats to save them. And the answer from the throne was a resounding cosmic no. Enoch was sent back down. The elevator descended. The crystal walls faded. He woke up by the waters of Dan, holding the verdict in his mind. He had to go back to the giants and their masters, who were waiting anxiously in the shadow of the mountain, and deliver the news that would trigger the apocalypse. The diplomatic channel was closed. The time for talking was over. The time for erasing was about to begin. When Enoch returned from the crystal structure, he was no longer just a scribe. He was the bearer of a cosmic death sentence. He found the Watchers gathered at Ubal-Sael, located between Lebanon and Senir. They were sitting with their heads covered in their hands, a gesture of profound mourning and terror. These beings, who had once commanded the elements and reshaped the genetics of the planet, were now huddled together like frightened children, waiting for a father's punishment. But the father was not coming to scold them. He had sent a human to dismiss them. Enoch stood before the weeping giants and their shining masters. The visual irony of this moment cannot be overstated. A mortal man, whose lifespan was a blink of an eye compared to theirs, was holding the scroll of their doom. He began to read the verdict, and the verdict was terrifying not because of its violence, but because of its psychological cruelty. The message from the throne was specific. It denied them the one thing every sentient being craves: rest. You have been in heaven, but all the mysteries had not yet been revealed to you, and you knew worthless ones, and these in the hardness of your hearts you have made known to the women. And through these mysteries, women and men work much evil on earth. Here is the indictment: gross negligence and the weaponization of forbidden knowledge. Then came the sentencing. The Most High did not order their immediate execution. That would have been too easy. Instead, he designed a punishment that fit the crime of mixing. He attacked their love. We often think of demons as loveless creatures, but the Book of Enoch suggests that the Watchers deeply loved their hybrid children, the Nephilim. They were proud of these men of renown. They saw them as their legacy, their foothold in the material world. So the judgment was tailored to break their hearts before it broke their bodies. You shall not have peace, and you shall see the destruction of your beloved ones. This is the psychological torture phase of the judgment. The Watchers were condemned to stand by and watch their children destroy each other. The order was given to the Archangel Gabriel: proceed against the bastards and the reprobates, and against the children of fornication, and send them one against the other, that they may destroy each other in battle. This explains the sudden eruption of violence that archaeology detects in the late prehistoric period. The Nephilim, driven by an induced madness or simply by their own aggressive nature, began a civil war. Imagine the scene. The giants, standing 15 feet tall, clad in the bronze armor taught by Azazel, tearing each other apart in fields of blood. Brother killing brother. And the Watchers, their fathers, were forced to watch. They were paralyzed. They could not intervene. They had to witness the extinction of their own bloodline, a slow-motion genocide of their own making. Enoch delivered the final, crushing line of the decree. And petition on their behalf shall not be granted, though they seek it. The door was locked. The diplomatic immunity was revoked. The concept of peace here is crucial. In Hebrew, the word is shalom. It doesn't just mean quiet, it means wholeness, completion, restoration. To be told, "You shall have no peace," means you will never be whole again. You will remain fractured, anxious, and in a state of perpetual disintegration for eternity. As Enoch finished reading, the silence of the mountain returned. The weeping stopped, replaced by a cold, hard realization. The game was over. The golden age of the gods was finished. The era of the prison was about to begin. But the watchers were not going to go quietly, and the earth, still screaming from the corruption, was about to undergo the most violent surgery in its geological history. The water was coming. But first, the archangels had to secure the prisoners. The binding of Azazel was the next operation on the list, and it would require a location so desolate, so remote, that it would serve as a maximum security facility for 70 generations. How do you clean a laboratory that has been contaminated with a lethal pathogen? You don't just wipe down the tables, you burn the room, you flood the facility, you sterilize everything down to the concrete. The earth was that laboratory. The pathogen was the genetic corruption of the watchers, and the sterilization protocol was the Great Flood. We have all heard the Sunday school version. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. A wooden boat floated on a rising tide. A dove flew out. It sounds peaceful, almost rhythmic. But if we look at the geological record, and if we read the specific language of the Book of Enoch and Genesis with a physicist's eye, we realize that rain was the least of humanity's problems. Rain does not cover Mount Everest. Rain does not flash freeze a woolly mammoth with buttercups still fresh in its mouth. We are not looking at a weather event. We are looking at a geophysical event. The text gives us a crucial clue in Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Notice the order. The windows of heaven, rain, are mentioned second. The primary event is the breaking of the fountains of the great deep. This suggests that the water did not come from the clouds. It came from below. Modern geologists and proponents of the hydroplate theory suggest that deep beneath the Earth's crust, trapped under miles of granite, lay massive chambers of supercritical water. Under immense pressure, this water was acting as a lubricant for the tectonic plates. When the judgment arrived, the crust cracked. Imagine the sound. A rip in the planetary surface extending for thousands of miles. The pressurized water from below exploded upward into the atmosphere with the force of 1,000 nuclear warheads. It would have shot into the stratosphere, frozen instantly into ice crystals, and then fallen back to Earth as a hyper-cooled sludge. This explains the mud rain. This explains why we find millions of animals buried in muck in the fossil record, twisted and crushed as if they were thrown into a blender. But the water was only the ammunition. The weapon was the spin. There is a theory known as crustal displacement, championed by Charles Hapgood and studied by Einstein. It suggests that the outer skin of the Earth, the crust, can slip over the molten inner mantle, like the skin of an orange sliding around the fruit. If the weight distribution of the planet changed, perhaps due to the massive accumulation of ice at the poles or a sudden impact, the crust would lurch. The North Pole would shift to the equator. The equator would shift to the pole. Think of the momentum. The Earth spins at 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. If the crust suddenly stops or shifts, the oceans do not stop. Inertia keeps them moving. The result would not be a rising tide. It would be a supersonic wall of water, miles high, scouring the continents clean. This fits the veiled history narrative perfectly. The Watchers had built great cities. They had mining operations. They had genetic laboratories. They had stargates on Mount Hermon. Where are they now? Why don't we find their steel and their glass? Because they were ground to dust. A tsunami traveling at 500 miles per hour, carrying billions of tons of rock and mud, acts like sandpaper. It erases civilization. It pulverizes stone. It creates a layer of sedimentary chaos that covers the old world under thousands of feet of mud. This is why we find marine fossils on mountain peaks. This is why the Sphinx shows signs of water erosion that could only have happened if the Sahara was once a rainforest. And this leads us to the most chilling piece of evidence: Antarctica. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, depicts the coastline of Antarctica with startling accuracy, but without ice. How could a medieval admiral know the shape of a continent that wouldn't be discovered for another 300 years and wouldn't be mapped by radar until the 1950s? He claims he copied it from ancient source maps. If we connect the dots, a terrifying picture emerges. Was Antarctica the home base of the Watchers? Was it the site of their Atlantis? When the crust shifted, that temperate continent was shoved instantly into the polar zone. The civilization wasn't just drowned, it was flash frozen. It was put on ice. The Book of Enoch describes the prison of the fallen angels as a place of chaos and emptiness, a place of fire and ice. Is it possible that the prison isn't a spiritual dimension, but a physical location? Are the ruins of the Watchers' empire sitting right now under 2 miles of ice, preserved perfectly, waiting for the day the ice melts? The mechanics of erasure were efficient. The slate was wiped clean. The genetic mistakes, the Nephilim, the chimeras, were crushed and buried in the mud, where their bones would mineralize into the fossils we gaze at in museums today, unaware of what they truly are. But water cannot kill a spirit. The bodies of the giants died, but their consciousness, that was a different problem. And the leaders of the rebellion, the 200 Watchers, could not be killed by physical means. They had to be extracted. While the waters churned and the continents slid, the archangels descended to perform a specific rendition operation. The target was Azazel, and his destination was a place even deeper than the bottom of the new ocean. Why water? If the Creator wanted to simply destroy the life on Earth, there were more efficient methods. An asteroid impact would have done it in seconds. A solar flare would have sterilized the surface with radiation. A plague could have targeted specific biological markers. But the judgment was hydrodynamic. To understand why, we must look at the properties of water not just as a substance, but as a solvent. In chemistry, water is the universal solvent. It dissolves more substances than any other liquid. It breaks down complex molecules. It washes away impurities. The Great Flood was not just an execution, it was a decontamination ritual. The target was not the sin in the abstract sense. The target was the blood. The Book of Enoch makes it clear that the earth was polluted by the blood of the giants. The DNA of the Watchers had mixed with the DNA of humans and animals, creating a biological slurry that was offensive to the structure of reality. When the waters rose, they didn't just drown the giants, they dissolved the physical evidence of the crime. The pressure of the deep ocean crushed the bones of the Nephilim, grinding their unnatural skeletons into sediment. The salt water scrubbed the soil, neutralizing the chemical residue of Semjaza's sorcery. It was a planetary baptism. But here lies the most terrifying twist in the Enochian narrative, a detail that explains the paranormal phenomena we experience to this day. You can kill the body of a Nephilim. You can drown a 15-foot giant. You can stop its heart and fill its lungs with silt. But what happens to its soul? Human souls, according to tradition, go to a specific place of rest or judgment. Angelic spirits belong in the higher dimensions. But the Nephilim were hybrids. They were half terrestrial, half celestial. They were unauthorized beings. They had no return address in the cosmic system. Heaven would not take them. The natural cycle of Earth didn't know what to do with them. So when their physical bodies died in the floodwaters, their spirits were trapped here. The Book of Enoch delivers the chilling diagnosis. And now, the giants, who are produced from the spirits and flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Read that again. This is the origin story of demons. In the Enochian worldview, demons are not fallen angels. The fallen angels are the watchers who are imprisoned. Demons are the disembodied ghosts of the dead Nephilim. They are the spirits of the giants, ripped from their powerful physical bodies by the catastrophe of the flood, now wandering the surface of the earth, invisible, hungry, and angry. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men and from the holy watchers. They shall be evil spirits on earth. This explains their behavior. Why do demons in every culture seek to possess humans? Why do they want to inhabit bodies? Because they miss their bodies. They used to be the masters of the physical world. They used to eat, drink, and dominate. Now they are reduced to frequencies, to whispers, to cold spots in a room. They are desperate to feel organic life again. They look at us, the survivors, the runts of the litter, with profound envy and hatred. They want to wear our skin. The flood washed away the monster you could see, but it inadvertently released the monster you cannot see. The physical threat, the giant, was replaced by the psychological threat, the demon. So, while the waters were receding, leaving a barren, mud-caked world for Noah to inherit, the atmosphere was thick with the screaming, confused spirits of the billions who had perished. But for the architects of this disaster, the 200 watchers, the punishment was not to wander. They were too dangerous to be left roaming as ghosts. They needed a supermax facility. The archangel Raphael was given the warrant for the arrest of Azazel. The location of his imprisonment is described with specific geological coordinates, and the method of his binding sounds less like magic and more like the containment of a radioactive core. The flood took care of the biological problem. The Nephilim were drowned. The chimeras were erased. The surface of the earth was scrubbed clean. But the source of the infection, the watchers themselves, remained. You cannot drown an entity that does not breathe oxygen. You cannot crush a being that exists partially in a higher state of matter. To deal with Semjaza, Azazel, and the 200 commanders, the archangels had to devise a solution that was not about execution, but about containment. The Book of Enoch describes a military operation led by the archangel Raphael. His orders regarding Azazel are precise, technical, and utterly terrifying. God says to Raphael, "Bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael, and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. Let us deconstruct this using the semantic pivot. Bind him hand and foot. This is not rope. A rope cannot hold a being that taught humanity how to smelt iron. This implies a stasis field. It implies a technology that locks the physical form in a state of immobility, perhaps neutralizing their ability to manipulate matter. Make an opening in the desert. This suggests a subterranean facility, a bunker, a silo. Cover him with rough and jagged rocks. Why specify the texture of the rocks? Why jagged? In modern radiation shielding, we use specific materials to block energy. Or perhaps this describes the debris field of a collapsed tunnel, a deliberate cave-in to ensure that no human could ever accidentally dig him up. The location is named Dudael. Scholars have argued over this word for centuries. Some translate it as the cauldron of God, others as the land of the dead. Some believe it is a specific location in the Judean wilderness, a rugged, unforgiving terrain where no life grows. Local Bedouins still avoid certain craters in that region, claiming they hear humming from beneath the ground. But others point to the jagged rocks and the darkness and look further south, much further south. If we return to the Antarctica theory, the idea that the Watcher's base was flash-frozen, then Dudael might be a specific location under the ice sheet. Imagine Azazel, the great innovator, the being who gave us the sword and the shield, now stripped of his power. He is shackled in a hyperbaric chamber, buried under miles of ice or rock, in absolute sensory deprivation. Cover his face that he may not see light. He is not dead. He is conscious. He is waiting. Think of the psychological horror. To be an immortal being, possessing the knowledge of the stars, trapped in a dark box for thousands of years. The boredom alone would drive a human mind to madness in a week. But Azazel is not human. He has time. And the text implies he is not alone. The other Watchers were also bound and cast into valleys of the earth. This creates a chilling map of our planet. We walk on the surface, building our cities and driving our cars, completely unaware that beneath our feet, deep in the crust, are supermax cells holding the most dangerous entities in the universe. We are living on top of a prison, and like any prison, the prisoners have a sentence. They were not locked up forever. They were locked up for a specific duration. The judge gave a number, and if we do the math, that number should terrify you. When a judge passes a sentence, the most important detail is the release date. In the Book of Enoch, the duration of the Watcher's imprisonment is explicitly stated. Bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. 70 generations. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a mathematical variable. To understand when the cell doors open, we just need to define the length of a generation. In biblical terms, a generation is often calculated as 70 years, Psalm 90:10, or sometimes 100 years, Genesis 15:13-16. Let's do the math. If we use the 70-year standard, 70 generations x 70 years, 900 years. Now, we need a starting point. The imprisonment began at the time of the flood or shortly before. Biblical chronology places Enoch and the pre-flood events roughly around 3000 BC to 2500 BC. If we take 3000 BC as a rough starting point and add 4,900 years, 3000 plus 4900, 1900 AD, the math brings us exactly to the 20th century. Look at the timeline of the 1900s. It was the century where everything changed. 1903, we learned to fly, the Wright brothers. 1945, we detonated the first atomic bomb, the Fire of Heaven. 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the Book of Enoch returns. 1947, Roswell and the UFO explosion, the return of the Watchers. 1969, we landed on the moon. Is it a coincidence that humanity went from riding horses to splitting the atom in the exact same window of time that the 70 generations sentence expired? The veiled history perspective suggests that the explosion of technology in the last 100 years is not due to human genius. It is due to parole. Perhaps the physical bodies of the Watchers are still in Dudael, but their influence, their signal, has been unblocked. Or perhaps the chains have physically loosened. This recontextualizes the modern UFO phenomenon. We look at the lights in the sky and ask, are they visitors from another galaxy? The Book of Enoch answers, no. They are the old inmates returning to the crime scene. They aren't discovering us. They are claiming us. The prison term is over. The restraining order has expired. And just as it was in the days of Noah, the sons of God are once again interacting with the daughters of men. We see this in the rise of genetic engineering, CRISPR. We see it in the obsession with transhumanism, merging man with machine. We are rebuilding the world of the Nephilim, brick by brick, guided by the same invisible hands that guided Azazel. The sentence was 70 generations. The clock has run out. And if the prisoners are loose, then the cycle is about to repeat. The survival of the Watcher's bloodline, the seed of the serpent, was the one variable the flood couldn't fully erase. How did the DNA survive? That is the final mystery we must solve. Because if the bloodline survived, then the enemy is not just in the sky. The enemy is in the palaces. The enemy is in the boardrooms. The enemy might be in us. History hates a paradox. It wants a straight line, cause and effect, crime and punishment. The narrative of the flood is supposed to be the ultimate clean break. The world was corrupt. The water came, the corruption ended. Noah and his family stepped off the ark into a brave new world, sterilized and safe. But there is a massive, glaring hole in this story. A hole so big that theologians have spent thousands of years trying to ignore it. If the flood was sent to wipe out the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers, and if the flood was successful, why are there still giants in the Bible after the flood? We all know the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was a giant, a champion of the Philistines, standing over 9 feet tall, clad in bronze armor. But Goliath lived thousands of years after Noah, and he wasn't alone. The Old Testament is filled with tribes of giants. The Anakim, the Etmim, the Zamzumim, the Rephaim. Where did they come from? If the water killed everything outside the ark, and the only people inside the ark were Noah and his family, then the DNA of the Watchers should have been erased from the universe. Unless it was inside the ark. This brings us to the most disturbing theory in the Enochian files, the Trojan horse theory. Earlier in the book of Genesis, we are given a clue with a phrase that acts as a chilling disclaimer. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. And also after that. How? We know that Noah was perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word used is tamim, which refers to physical integrity. It means unblemished, pure. Noah's DNA was 100% human. That is why he was chosen. But what about his daughters-in-law? Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They took 3 wives onto the ark. The Bible does not describe the lineage of these women. Is it possible that one of them, specifically the wife of Ham, carried the recessive gene? Apply the semantic pivot. We are not talking about sin here. We are talking about epigenetics and recessive traits. Imagine the DNA of the Nephilim not as a physical giant, but as a code, a virus written into the genome. A woman could look perfectly human, normal size, normal intelligence, but carry the markers of the Watchers in her junk DNA. She enters the ark. The rain falls. The world drowns. The physical giants outside are crushed by the water pressure. The experiment seems to be over, but inside the wooden hull, surviving on the breath of the 8 passengers, the serpent seed is waiting. When the waters receded and the new population began to multiply, the gene resurfaced. This explains why the lineage of Ham, Noah's son, is cursed. Ham becomes the father of Canaan. And who lives in the land of Canaan? The giants. When Moses sends spies into the land of Canaan hundreds of years later, they come back terrified, reporting, "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Numbers 13:33. They didn't say tall men. They used the specific word Nephilim. This implies that the flood failed to sterilize the earth completely. It was a partial success. It reset the population numbers, but it did not eradicate the root code. This changes our understanding of the brutal wars of the Old Testament. Modern readers look at the God of the Old Testament and see a genocidal tyrant. He orders Joshua to enter the land of Canaan and kill everything that breathes: men, women, children, and even the livestock. It seems horrific. It seems indefensible. But if you look at it through the lens of the concealment narrative, the motive changes. This wasn't a war of religion. It was a genetic cleanup operation. God wasn't ordering the death of innocent humans. He was ordering the extermination of the hybrid resurgence. He was trying to finish the job that the flood started. The tribes that Joshua destroyed, the Amorites, the Amalekites, were the carriers of the Watcher DNA. If they had been allowed to spread, the human race would have been genetically eclipsed once again. But even Joshua couldn't get them all. The genes survived. It went underground. And this leads us to the origin of the divine right of kings. Look at the Sumerian king list. It is an ancient stone tablet that lists the rulers of Mesopotamia. It divides history into 2 parts, before the flood and after the flood. The kings before the flood reigned for impossible lengths of time, 20,000 years, 30,000 years. Immortality, Watcher, DNA. Then the flood comes. Then the list says, after the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven. The kingship descended from heaven. This is the claim of the elite. For thousands of years, the royal families of the world have claimed that they are not like the common people. They claim a divine right to rule. They intermarry only with each other to keep the bloodline pure. Pure from what? Or pure of what? Are they trying to keep human DNA out? Or are they trying to preserve the trace amounts of Watcher DNA that gives them the spark of authority? We see this obsession with blood everywhere. The blue bloods of Europe. The Rh-negative blood type, a blood type that science cannot fully explain the origin of, which acts strangely when mixed with positive blood types, like a mother's body rejecting her own fetus. Is it possible that the survivors of the Nephilim didn't disappear into history, but rather climbed the ladder of society? They traded their physical size for intellectual dominance. They stopped being giants of stature and became giants of industry, giants of finance, giants of war. The Book of Enoch suggests that the spirits of the giants became demons, but the genetics of the giants became the aristocracy. This means the shadow order that we fear, the Illuminati, the deep state, the hidden hand, is not just a political club. It is a biological family tree. They are the custodians of the legacy of the Watchers, and they have been waiting for the 70 generations to pass, so they can finally be reunited with their fathers. If the blood of the Watchers survived in the veins of kings, what happened to their mind? Blood is powerful, but knowledge is dangerous. Azazel didn't just breed, he taught. He introduced metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetics, and the cutting of roots. He introduced a level of civilization that was centuries ahead of its time. When the floodwaters rose, they destroyed the factories and the laboratories. But you cannot drown an idea. The ancients understood that a cataclysm was coming. Whether it was Enoch or Seth or the children of Lamech, they knew that the reset was imminent. And like any civilization facing extinction, their primary concern was data preservation. They didn't want to start over from zero. They wanted to ensure that the forbidden knowledge, the secrets of the Watchers, would survive the water. This leads us to one of the most enduring and mysterious legends in secret society lore: the legend of the two pillars. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, records a strange tradition. He says that the descendants of Seth, or in Masonic tradition, the children of Lamech, discovered the wisdom of the stars and the geometry of the universe, and that their inventions might not be lost before they were sufficiently known. Upon Adam's prediction that the world was to be destroyed at one time by the force of fire, and at another time by the violence and quantity of water, they made two pillars, the one of brick, the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries on them both. Let's apply the semantic pivot. These were not decorative columns. These were hard drives. They were time capsules, engineered to withstand specific environmental hazards. The pillar of brick was designed to survive fire. The pillar of stone was designed to survive water. They inscribed all distinct sciences onto these pillars: geometry, astronomy, the secret ratios of the universe, the very technology that Azazel had traded for the human soul. The legend says that the flood came, and the civilization was washed away. But when the waters receded, the pillar of stone remained. Who found it? Some traditions say it was Hermes Trismegistus, Thoth in Egypt. Others say it was the founders of Babylon, but the implication is the same. The advanced knowledge of the pre-flood world was excavated. It was not reinvented. It was recovered. This changes the entire trajectory of human history. We are taught that human progress is a slow, linear climb from the cave to the skyscraper. We invented the wheel, then the cart, then the car. But the two pillars theory suggests that history is actually a recovery operation. We aren't discovering new things. We are remembering old things. We are reverse engineering the scraps of technology left behind by the Watchers. Look at the pyramids of Giza. Mainstream archaeology tells us they were built by people with copper chisels and ropes. Yet, they embody mathematical constants: pi, phi, and align with the stars with a precision that we struggle to match today with lasers. Is the Great Pyramid the pillar of stone mentioned in the legend? Is it the indestructible vault of data that survived the flood? It stands to reason. It is water-resistant. It is earthquake-proof. It is a geometric message that requires no language to read, only math. This secret, that the wisdom of the ancients is actually the forbidden science of the Watchers, is the core secret of the mystery schools. Look at the symbolism of Freemasonry. Every Masonic lodge is adorned with two pillars, Jachin and Boaz. They are said to represent the pillars of Solomon's temple. But the esoteric inner circle knows that Solomon's pillars were just a copy of the original antediluvian pillars. They represent the survival of knowledge through chaos. Why is this important? Because it means that the great work of these secret societies is not just about building character. It is about rebuilding the tower. It is about reconstructing the civilization that existed before the flood. A civilization of global unity, one language, and godlike technology. A civilization ruled by the sons of God. We see this legacy of knowledge exploding in the last few centuries. For thousands of years, humanity moved slowly. Then, suddenly, in the blink of an eye, we unlocked electricity. We unlocked the atom. We unlocked the genome. We built the internet, a digital one-world language. Is it a coincidence that this explosion happened exactly as the 70 generations sentence of the Watchers was expiring? Or is it because the pillars have been fully decoded? We are now living in a world that looks suspiciously like the pre-flood world described by Enoch. We have Azazel's sword, nuclear weapons. We have Semjaza's sorcery, big pharma. We have the mask, digital avatars and plastic surgery. We have chimeras, CRISPR and transgenics. The blueprint has been followed to the letter. The hidden hand has successfully guided humanity back to the exact state of affairs that triggered the first judgment. The bloodline survived. The knowledge survived. And now, the timeline is converging. The stage is set. The actors are in place. The props, the technology, are ready. All that is missing is the final curtain call. And the Book of Enoch tells us exactly how that curtain falls. It doesn't end with water. It ends with fire. And it ends with the return of the original cast. There is a specific rhythm to history. It does not move in a straight line. It moves in a spiral. It circles back, passing the same coordinates, but on a different level. The most famous prophecy regarding the end of the current age does not speak of a new threat. It speaks of an old one. In the New Testament, a specific warning is given. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For centuries, preachers have interpreted this as a warning about moral decay. They say people will be eating, drinking, and marrying, distracted by the pleasures of life while the storm gathers. But if we view this through the lens of the Enochian files, the warning takes on a much more terrifying physical dimension. To understand the future, we must ask, what exactly was it like in the days of Noah? It was not just a time of bad behavior. It was a time of genetic chaos. It was a time of interspecies blending. It was a time when the Watchers were physically present on Earth, directing human civilization. It was a time of transhumanism. Look around you. Look at the headlines of the 21st century. Are we not looking at a mirror image of the pre-flood world? 1. The return of the mixture, transgenics. Just as the Watchers sinned against the birds and beasts, modern science has broken the species barrier. We are growing human organs in pigs. We are splicing spider DNA into goats. We are using CRISPR technology to edit the human genome, promising to eliminate disease but opening the door to designer babies, the modern Nephilim. We are no longer content to be human. We want to be better than human. We are rewriting the source code of the Creator, just as Semjaza did. 2. The return of the global eye, surveillance. The Watchers were named for their function, to watch. In the ancient world, they occupied the high ground. Today, we have built an artificial Watcher grid. Satellites, drones, and AI algorithms monitor every movement, every transaction, every word. We have built a digital panopticon that replicates the all-seeing gaze of the fallen entities. 3. The return of the Oracle, AI and the Metaverse. Semjaza taught the cutting of roots to alter reality. Today, we have silicon. We are building a metaverse, a digital hallucination where humans can disconnect from the physical world and live as avatars. We are summoning artificial intelligence, communicating with a non-human consciousness that we do not fully understand, asking it for answers, just as the ancients consulted their spirits. We are building the Tower of Babel 2.0. The ancient tower was an attempt to reach the heavens and challenge God. Today, our tower is the Internet, a unified global mind that connects all humanity in a single language of binary code. The parallels are not symbolic, they are literal. The reason the prophecy says as it was in the days of Noah is because the conditions are identical. The fence that was put up after the flood, the barrier that kept the human bloodline pure and the knowledge limited, has been torn down. We have found the hidden pillars. We have decoded the forbidden science. And in our arrogance, we have signaled to the cosmos that we are ready for the next stage of contact. We think we are progressing, but in reality, we are simply setting the stage for the old actors to take their places. The 70 generations are up. The technology is restored. The bloodlines are positioned. The only thing missing is the arrival. If the prison sentence has expired and the world has been prepared for their return, what does that look like? It doesn't look like an invasion. An invasion implies a foreign force attacking a sovereign nation. But the Watchers do not see themselves as foreigners. They see themselves as the owners. They were here before us. They ruled us for thousands of years. In their eyes, they are simply returning to manage their assets after a long, forced absence. This brings us to the great deception. If 200 shining entities descended onto Mount Hermon tomorrow, or if massive cities of crystal appeared over New York and London, how would the world react? Would we grab our Bibles and call them demons? Or would we look at their technology, their beauty, and their power, and call them saviors? The Book of Enoch warns us that they are masters of the mask. Azazel taught us to paint our faces. Surely he knows how to paint his own. They will not come with horns and pitchforks. They will likely come as space brothers, or interdimensional guides, or the progenitors. They will tell us that they created us, which, in the case of the hybrid bloodlines, is technically true. They will offer to solve our problems. Is your planet dying? We can fix the weather. They control the elements. Are you afraid of death? We can upload your consciousness. They understand the soul. Do you want peace? We will give you a one-world government, just like the pre-flood empire. But the price of their help will be exactly what it was 5,000 years ago, your DNA and your soul. The files of Enoch were not unsealed in 1947 for entertainment. They were unsealed as a final briefing before the event. The silence of the universe is over. The strange sounds heard around the world, the lights in the sky, the feeling of anticipation. It is the sound of footsteps approaching the door. The history you have just heard is not a story about the past. It is a prequel to tomorrow's news. The Watchers are not coming. They are already here. And the question is not what they will do to us. The question is, whose side are you on when the sky opens?